Un mundo tan desafiante, nuestro reto es ser la luz, dar amor día con día.
Ven y seamos esperanza, testimonio de valores, de unidad y de alegría.
Muy bien, pues estamos de vuelta con un panel súper interesante que nos va a llevar a entender el panorama internacional con el tema de la familia. Entonces, bueno, Mario, a ver.
Sí, porque este panel, será moderado por Doug Clark, de la International Organization for the Family, y en este panel van a participar varios actores que trabajan en los ámbitos internacionales, desde donde se hacen muchas iniciativas o lo que le llaman leyes suaves, tratados, que también pueden afectar para bien o para mal a sus familias. Entonces nos van a contar de todo esto y pues los vamos presentando, Pau, ¿no?
Claro que sí, Mario. Pues bueno, este panel va a tener como ponentes a Grace Melton, a Wendy Wickham, a Sharon Slater, a Marsha Barlow y, como bien dijo Mario, nuestro moderador de este panel va a ser Doug Clark. Les pido por favor que lo recibamos con un fuerte aplauso. Valerie también fue invitada para este panel que la tuvimos hace rato en el panel de la mañana, pues aquí está otra vez con nosotros.
Welcome to our panel on the United Nations. Here in this World Congress of Families, you may wonder why we need a panel on the United Nations. You will find the answer today in these distinguished panelists that we have. Beginning here, we have Wendy Wickham, President of United Families International. We have Marsha Barlow, co-chair of the NGO Committee on the Family in the United Nations. We have Grace Melton, Senior Associate for International Social Issues at the Heritage Foundation in Washington. Sharon Slater, President of Family Watch International. And that's what shows on your program today. We have asked Valerie Huber to honor us by responding. After our panelists finish, Valerie will give a response, give us thoughts of her own. Just briefly, by way of introduction, the reason that these distinguished panelists and Valerie work so hard is because on family policy to protect the family in the United Nations is because of a strange development since 1948. That was the year that the United Nations issued its Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Every one of those rights is an individual right, individual human beings, with one exception, and that is Article 16.3, which says the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and must be, and is entitled, let me do that again. The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. The family itself has rights. Strangely, in the last few decades, because of powerful NGOs and powerful countries who see the family and children and marriage differently, there's been a dramatic reversal of role with the United Nations. Now, instead of protecting the family, announcing the truth of the family, in fact, we are obligated to do our best to do battle in the United Nations to uphold the family. The only honorary board member of my organization, the International Organization for the Family, has talked about, this is President Dallin H. Oaks. He's spoken of enemies and conditions that threaten to undermine the family. Ironically, some of these enemies are working through the UN and its stature and authority on the world stage to pursue anti-family efforts that must be of concern to us all. We must act to preserve the families of the world. These 5 individuals are acting with great valor, with great intelligence, and great effectiveness. We are honored to have them here. Wendy, we'll hear from you.
Es un honor estar aquí contigo. Y ahora, en inglés. When people hear the words United Nations, they may picture peacekeeping forces or humanitarian efforts to relieve suffering from famine or displacement. For this work, we are grateful. Yet the UN's reach is deeper and its interest broader than most realize. Unfortunately, too few people understand how UN influence trickles down and impacts our lives, our homes, and our families. Formed at the end of World War II, the UN had a central mission to maintain international peace and security. The UN also cared about the family and societies and the status of women in the world. During the early days of the United Nations, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark exerted disproportionately strong influence. With their highly egalitarian ideals, they implemented a governmental and economic system that was admired in Western Europe. Many early UN leaders were from these Nordic countries and were instrumental in promoting their ideas about women's advancement. Addressing historic discrimination and oppression of women, the Nordic approach to advancing gender equality, which became the UN approach, began with restructuring family life, in particular, the role of mothers. Powerful bureaucrats within the UN used their position and their money to fund like-minded social scientists anxious to promote their family ideology. Home and family, in their minds, symbols of oppression towards women and children, with marriage as its foundation, would be replaced by a central state. They taught that home and family were patriarchal, oppressive institutions, and women would find greater purpose and meaning in work outside of the home. The work of raising children was a burden, best left to the state. This restructuring of family life was to help liberate women. They promoted less restrictive abortion laws, easier access to contraceptives, and sex education that disconnected sexual intimacy from its role in marriage and family formation. Decades later, these ideas have taken root in the general public, now a reality that shapes attitudes in the Western world. Today, the United Nations continues to export this ideology to poor and less developed countries. Common strategies include pressuring countries for their vote or for national implementation of their programs or ideology by withholding financial assistance or through the use of compliance committees. For every conference held by the UN, they produce a document meant to be a guide to nations in addressing societal issues and formulating policy. UN delegates negotiate over language until consensus is reached or until no one expresses disagreement. Controversial issues are often decided in the middle of the night, especially a disadvantage to smaller delegations. The chairman of the negotiation has power to arbitrarily steer the process by choosing who can speak, thus guiding the outcome of the discussion and favoring a small but vocal group of negotiators. There are 3 levels of international agreements: treaties, conventions, and resolutions. Each binds nations in different ways and with different powers of enforcement. Treaties are the strongest agreement. They are legally binding instruments that governments agree to follow. After a government signs on to a treaty, if they do not live up to their agreements, they can be punished through trade sanctions and worse. A less binding authority is the convention. Governments may agree to them and then resist their implementation. Each convention comes with a UN governing body before which governments must periodically report. Governments may ignore such orders, but pressure is brought upon them to comply. Finally, resolutions must pass through the Economic and Social Council and then through the correct UN General Assembly Committee before being ratified by the General Assembly. Most UN business is communicated through General Assembly resolutions. It must be emphasized that UN resolutions are non-binding on all parties. Resolutions are mere suggestions. One might reason, if my government hasn't ratified a UN document, then it is not bound by it, right? Yet by passing repeated resolutions on the same topics, using similar wording each time, the UN is creating a form of international case law or precedent. Precedents may bypass federal legislative process. The executive branch of a domestic government may implement these through executive action. Courts may look upon UN documents in shaping decisions. Progressive courts can use precedent to push their agenda. Often, these precedents are used by state and municipal governments, or schools, private institutions, foundations, and agencies that can recommend and implement policies, even if their federal government does not. While the UN sounds far away and out of reach, in all these ways and more, the UN trickles down, impacting your life, your home, and your family. Thank you.
Great to be with you, and thank you, Wendy, for that great overview and explaining some of the dynamics of the UN system. That provides an opportunity for me to speak about the UN NGO Committee on the Family. It may come as a surprise to many of you that the words family and families are among the most controversial and hotly contested words found in the halls of the UN. Much of the angst centers around the definition of family versus families, the plural. Thus, the UN NGO Committee on the Family is a bit of an anomaly, as it is an officially recognized committee within the UN system, and the committee has been successful at bridging different worldviews, rising above a highly polarized political environment to work together to do what we've all agreed is a very important thing. Looks like I've lost my slide. That important thing is to promote, preserve, and protect the well-being of the family. Now, how is this done? Like many organizations here at this conference, the NGO Committee on the Family educates the public and policymakers on international issues affecting the family. Let's see if I can get this up. There we go. Advocates for the inclusion of the family in international resolutions and policies, but most importantly, it shares a positive perspective on family. Why would any of this matter? Well, we all know that the world has a lot of challenges: providing education, medical care, clean water, alleviating poverty, reducing child and maternal mortality, and being a wise steward of our environment. So many challenges that the UN has developed a series of targets encompassed in the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals. Too often, though, families are thought of as this entity that just gobbles up scarce resources, or an entity that takes, or at the very least, needs to be taken care of. We see it very differently. The family is not a source of world problems. In fact, it's a huge part of the solution. How do you solve the problem of poverty and hunger without considering the role of family in meeting physical needs? How do you achieve education for all the world's children without considering the day-to-day involvement and efforts of parents? How do you reduce maternal and child mortality without recognizing the role of fathers and families and what is occurring in the home? Finally, how do you combat diseases like HIV or COVID without the support, teaching, and care of committed family members and parents? I only have time to share a couple examples of the power of the family. Every year, millions upon millions of dollars are poured into international programs, and most of these programs have yielded very meager results. But take a look at this program. The Antonian family lives in one of the poorest countries in the world. They participated in the Family Preservation Program developed and implemented by Care for Life. This program goes to the heart of sustainable development by focusing on creating self-reliant families. They do that through allowing families to develop leadership skills and then make decisions regarding their own employment. Secondly, families set goals in 8 areas of focus, and when the family achieves 80% of those goals, they are eligible for things like agricultural supplies or building materials and tuition for training courses. And third, the families are then allowed to save and borrow from their own credit and savings and loans association. Nothing is done for the families that they can do for themselves. And the program yields some quite extraordinary results. The black bars are the initial assessment when a village begins this program. Gold bars are the exit assessment. Note the areas dealing with sanitation, water, and health. Villages saw close to 100% saturation. The small businesses more than doubled. Adult literacy improved by almost 60%. Maternal deaths after implementing the Family Preservation Program, not one in over 1,000 births. Another example, this family lives high in the Bolivian Andes, where a shift in thinking led to the creation of water wells based on the FLOAM principle, family-level operation and maintenance. Each family owns their own simple well, dug, built, maintained, and repaired, not by the community, not by the government, but by the individual family. Turns out, the family-focused nature of the wells ended up being the secret sauce for this program's success. I am out of time, but please understand, there is no end to the residual talents, abilities, and potential output of motivated and empowered families. And the converse, without the family, there is no effective, efficient, and sustainable development. If I could leave you with just one message, it would be this. The family, including yours, is the solution. Build a strong one. Make your family the center of your life. And when building strong families returns to being a focal point for the world, that's when we'll see real and impactful change. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Buenas tardes. I'd like to briefly explain some of the mechanisms of the UN and how policies that impact the family are made that Wendy touched on. First, there are treaties. Treaties are negotiated and then signed and often ratified by each country that is a party to the treaty, and then it becomes binding law on those countries. There are also UN resolutions, which are negotiated by the member states and adopted by consensus. These resolutions are not legally binding on member states, but they do determine how UN agencies carry out their work. And finally, there is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which houses the treaty bodies and special procedures. The real threats to life and family come from the treaty body recommendations, where the experts often tell states that they need to remove barriers to abortion or promote policies based on sexual orientation and gender identity in order to comply with the treaties. I'd like to discuss what I see as the greatest threats that the UN poses to families. These are the promotion of abortion and radical gender ideology. The right to life is protected in international human rights law, including in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as in the constitutions or domestic laws of many countries around the world, particularly in Latin America and Africa. Historically, the right to life has been understood to apply to all members of the human family, including the unborn. The ICCPR, which is a legally binding treaty, states, "Every human being has the inherent right to life." It also prohibits the death penalty from being carried out against a pregnant woman for the duration of her pregnancy, which supports the idea that the right to life is extended to the unborn. There is no right to abortion in binding international law. But that fact doesn't stop abortion advocates and their allies in liberal governments and the UN system from insisting that abortion is part of women's rights or is necessary for achieving other rights. For example, human rights experts often tell countries that they need to remove barriers to abortion in order to comply with human rights treaties. In fact, the UN human rights apparatus has found or created a right to abortion within the rights to health, privacy, and even in the right to be free from cruel and degrading treatment. This is perhaps the most glaring example of a UN body instructing countries to legalize abortion, but it is just one of countless examples. In 2019, the UN Human Rights Committee issued a general comment on abortion. It said that states must provide safe, legal, and effective access to abortion under a variety of circumstances, and that states cannot regulate abortion in such a way that it causes women and girls to have unsafe abortions. This illustrates the process of building up soft law that runs counter to the text of a treaty that member states agreed to. It's a case of just repeating something false over and over and over again enough to make it become true. And it's effective. Within the last few years, courts in Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil have all cited UN treaty bodies as sources of legal guidance related to their own domestic laws on abortion. Gender ideology is another significant threat to the family that is increasingly prevalent at the UN. Gender theory is the controversial view that sex is merely assigned at birth and is subordinate to an internal gender identity. Proponents of gender theory insist that a person self-determines his or her own gender as male or female, or both, or neither, based on the gender identity at their emotional or psychological core. Gender theory considers the mere existence of sex categories to be oppressive. It seeks to force everyone and all social institutions to reject the reality of biological sex and to repeat falsehoods about human reproduction in the family. These next slides show graphics of the gender unicorn and the genderbread person, which are tools that activists are using around the world to introduce concepts of gender ideology to our children. Policies that treat people based upon their gender identity undermine decades of efforts to remedy historical and societal injustices that disproportionately affect women and girls by benefiting any male who self-identifies as a woman. Allowing for the self-identification of gender gives men and boys unfettered access to female-only private spaces, like restrooms, showers, and changing rooms, if those biological men or boys claim to identify as female. At the UN, activists have begun to reinterpret the word sex in foundational treaties to include sexual orientation. For example, the committee that focuses on eliminating discrimination against women has incorporated gender identity into its guidance on women's access to justice, education, combating gender-based violence, and even climate change. I'm nearly out of my time, so I will end with a quick call to action for all of us here at the World Congress of Families. We need to encourage our leaders and policymakers to be confident in protecting life and family, and to be strong in resisting the legal pressures and financial incentives that the UN places on them to accept abortion and radical gender theory. In particular, Latin American countries that have pro-life domestic policies need to call upon their governments to protect these values in international fora and resist international bullying on these issues. Thank you.
Hola. Es un honor estar con ustedes. Disculpe que voy a presentar en inglés. Okay. Today I'm going to speak about the UN's global assault on our children and our families. And okay, thank you. This assault is coming from multiple UN agencies, and I'm going to show you the proof. And we're going to start with the World Health Organization. They are charged with protecting the health of everyone in the world. Yet, in this publication, published with multiple other UN agencies, they are calling for the legalization of same-sex marriage, the decriminalization of sex work, which is prostitution, access to hormonal treatment and gender reassignment surgery. The governments are supposed to provide all this, and they're saying that human rights standards require that governments provide adolescents sexual and reproductive health services without parental consent. They also say that comprehensive sexuality education is crucial for children. What is that? Comprehensive sexuality education, also known as CSE, is the #1 tool used to advance the global sexual rights agenda, and they're after our children. They know if they can capture our children and indoctrinate them in their radical sexual and gender ideologies, that they will have the future leaders and the future families. And of course, their partner is International Planned Parenthood Federation, as you can see on the World Health Organization website. International Planned Parenthood Federation, IPPF, is one of the greatest threats to our children and our families worldwide. They're helping to write manuals like this, the Standards for Sexuality Education for Europe, which says that children as young as 0 to 4 should be taught about sexual pleasure and touching their bodies and be confused about their gender identities. It also sends children starting at age 9 to Planned Parenthood to learn about their sexual rights. And what will they learn there? They'll find this document called Exclaim, Young People's Guide to Sexual Rights, an IPPF declaration that actually states that children are entitled to sexual pleasure. And if they're not having different forms of sexual pleasure, they're not having good health. They also will send children to this book about rights for people or children who are infected with the HIV virus. They'll be told they have a right to sexual pleasure, how to get sexual pleasure, just have fun. And it is unconscionable that the World Health Organization would send children to Planned Parenthood to learn that they don't have to tell their sexual partners that they're infected with the HIV virus. UNESCO, they're involved in this agenda. They published the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education with multiple UN agencies supporting them. And there again, the focus is on sexual pleasure and many other things we don't have time to show you. This is the guidance for the whole world. UNICEF, they're supposed to be protecting the world's children. They're involved in this agenda under the banner of sexual and reproductive health and rights with all these UN agencies. They're trying to reach children as young as age 10 and telling them that sexting, the sending of nude photos and videos, is good, will build children's self-esteem and help them to develop relationships. This is UNICEF. This is sexual abuse. This is grooming 101. Then you have the UN human rights system, which has been totally corrupted. These UN agencies have been captured by donor countries. As you can see, the top donors to the UN human rights system come from Europe and the United States. And they're corrupting the top UN experts. If you can imagine, this woman, Dr. Talalang Mofokeng, was appointed as the top expert for the United Nations on mental and physical health. She's a former abortion provider, and she promotes the legalization of prostitution. She has her own pleasure book teaching about sexual pleasure. She actually says that purchasing intimacy, that's prostitution, and paying for it can be affirming, and that some people can have their kinks and their preferences fulfilled by a, quote, sex worker. And she advocates, again, for the legalization of prostitution. She says, my approach and goal is to elevate sexual pleasure. Can you imagine? This is the top health expert of the United Nations. It looks like we're facing a 12-headed monster that we can't possibly stop, but I'll tell you, there is good news, and we have a lot of tools that we would like to provide for you, and I know that the organizations presented here also have many tools that could help you. First of all, we'd like to offer to all of you our Family Defense Handbook for free, an electronic version. If you go to our booth, it's booth 605 here, we'd love to have you get our electronic version so you can have the tools to fight this. You can go to our website and sign up for our newsletter, and there is an option for Spanish. En español puede tener estas noticias mundial sobre la familia. These UN agencies, if you want to learn more, we have a webinar on each of them that you can access on our website. And also we have links to comprehensive sexuality education programs and their problematic elements throughout the world. We've done a lot of work for you. You can find them at our Stop CSE website. And you can also find our Family Defense our Child Protection Toolkit, where you can even have plans and research and PowerPoints and all sorts of things to help you that you can use freely to protect children at stopcse.org, including this documentary that reveals a lot of what I've just shared today. You can share it freely, and it's in multiple languages. This is about our children. This is about protecting the health and innocence of our children. I invite each and one of you, every one of you here has power to do something, and some of you have power and influence that you are not using yet, that we need your help with to help protect the health and innocence of children. Because as the children go, so goes the family, so goes the nation, so goes the world. Thank you.
we thank these marvelous panelists for their presentations and their work that makes such a difference. At our request, Valerie Huber has consented to respond to our panel today. And most of you were here, I'm presuming this morning, heard her powerful address to us. Currently, Valerie is president of the Institute for Women's Health. Previously, in a previous U.S. administration, she served as the United States Special Representative for Global Women's Health. And in that capacity, she was instrumental, a major force in creating the Geneva Global Consensus. Do I have that right? And we are very grateful for her. We're grateful that she would be here with us today.
Well, what an honor to share the stage with women who are fighters, who know their stuff, and are making a difference at the United Nations. I was feverishly taking notes as each of them were talking, and I was thinking about back to when I was responsible for crafting a lot of policy for the United States, recommending and drafting things for our negotiations at the United Nations. And I think that the panel did an excellent job of telling us the problem, and I was trying to think about what is the solution? It's not simple. No, it's not easy, but it is simple. I think that the real problem is the United Nations is off the tracks. They need to stay within their mandate, and they're not. The other problem is countries need to be unified in demanding accountability of the United Nations to stay within their mandate, which they are not doing. I jotted down some reasons why I think that is, and some of the panelists mentioned this. These countries, especially small aid-dependent countries, are being intimidated and actually threatened if they don't keep their mouths shut or if they don't stay silent on the values of their own country. Second, some of these countries have such tiny little delegations that they can't be at all the UN meetings at the same time. There's simply not enough staff to go around, and so they don't know what's going on as much as they need to. A big problem is there's dishonesty among the United Nations agencies. They will tell the countries one thing that they think the countries want to hear, and then they will use those very terms in a very different way that will then pressure those countries to do things that they didn't think they were agreeing to. The other thing is, nations have multiple priorities, and I learned this when I was representing the United States. We were the most pro-life administration in U.S. history, I believe, and yet a single resolution could have multiple priorities that we had to balance those things, and it's difficult to understand that unless you know the priorities of your government that are beyond the social issues. So I think really the solution is there needs to be a priority on accountability to the United Nations. One thing we were going to do, if we had more time to do it, was to tie funding to UN agencies to staying within their mandates, and to tie a memorandum of understanding between governments to the United Nations, where the United Nations was not calling all the shots. This hasn't been used by governments, and it should be. And then secondly, I mentioned the Geneva Consensus Declaration. One of the reasons that we saw such a need for it is because of the very things that these panelists were talking about. If this coalition were actually activated as it needed to be at the United Nations, they could negotiate strategies together for those resolutions and push back much more effectively. They could demand transparency of grant programs. They could ensure that official agreements from regional conferences aren't taken as the same weight as official documents and resolutions that are passed by all the nations in the United Nations. Those are just a few things. These are all tools that are at the disposal of governments, and NGOs have a great way to help in this regard too, because NGOs can do things that governments can't, and governments can do things that NGOs can't. Those who are fighting against the family do a very good job of tying those two together, and we need to do the same. Thanks.
Thank you for coming to our panel today, and thank you to the panelists and Valerie. Let's give them one final round of applause, please. And I believe the next panel will begin immediately here, if I understand correctly.
Un mundo tan desafiante, nuestro reto es ser la luz, dar amor día con